unable to actually run. I once we went to full screen, I wasn't able to move the slides anymore.
Okay. I'm going to
So
stop
I might
sharing.
just have to share.
Yeah.
So you guys should now be able to see the slides again. Looking good? Okay.
Not quite.
So nope.
There it is.
All right. So let me take you back to the top. Sorry for that. Also, if at any point people can't hear me, like shout out. I've been having weird internet trying to connect today. But I'm Nicole Keleher. I work with Mass Wildlife. And it may seem like, why does Mass Wildlife care about Southern Pine Beetle? And we care a lot, and we care a lot about a lot of invasive species that are threatening habitats and natural communities across our state and are really important in how we approach protecting these resources. Um, and prior to coming to Mass Wildlife last year, I was the forest health director with UCR, and worked on all sorts of insect and disease issues in our forests, including a lot of work with Southern Pine Beetle. And that's how I first met Ryan and started working with Webner on some of this project. And my team at Mass Wildlife, we are a diverse group that works on all sorts of habitats and projects across the state, like prescribed fire and thinning and invasive plant control. And it really builds upon my background prior to coming to Massachusetts and working with DCR and their forest health department. I had the opportunity to work in Alaska in a fish hatchery and in Arizona doing riparian habitat, and in Washington State working for a group of tribes doing watershed habitat management. So I'm really excited to be here and kind of bring those experiences and help with some of this work that we've been undertaking the last few years. Jumping over to Ryan.
Thanks. Are you okay advancing the slides, Nicole?
Yes.
Okay, I do have a couple of animations here, but well, good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us, and pleased to join Nicole in telling you about the story of Southern Pine Beetle and how it's recently arrived at Waquoit Bay Reserve. And just to tell you a little bit about my background, how I got into this role, um, I basically from, really young age was just totally interested and fascinated in just about everything in the natural world. And I actually kind of took a while to really figure out exactly what I wanted to do. So I guess you could say I took like the scenic route in my career. But once I kind of finally settled on something that I really knew I was genuinely interested in was studying ecology and, just trying to understand the environment more and really work outdoors. And I've always had a particular passion for birds. I guess if there is such a thing as like a spirit animal, bird would definitely be mine. And there's two sort of jobs I had when I was doing my undergraduate degree that I think really kind of were like the formative, you know, groundwork for what really led into my main career paths. And one of those, I worked as a research assistant on some bird nest studies and worked with, mist netting birds and banning them. So that's what these photos here represent. And the other job I had was actually doing monitoring of water quality and hydrology for salmon habitat. And I'll come back to that in a bit. But somehow, if Nicole, if you could advance, I ended up going to New Zealand. I spent a lot of time crawling around in dense coastal shrubs, looking for. If Nicole, advance one more, Nicole. I was doing a master's degree on yellow-eyed penguins and understanding their nesting habitat requirements. Um, during that, I was during doing the master's degree, I really started getting into GIS, remote sensing, and ended up getting into that field for a few years. Ultimately, I ended up coming back to where I started in California, and I had a really great job working on ecological restoration projects, which really took me back into, as I mentioned earlier, the sort of water quality and hydrology monitoring. Um, the COVID pandemic, when that hit in 2020, it kind of forced me to make some decisions about making some changes. Um, and that eventually led to me landing this really great job here I have at Waquoit Bay Reserve as stewardship coordinator. So before I get more into the details, I just wanted to back up a little bit. And Sonia already covered some of this, but just to give people who might not be aware or to refresh those of you who already know this, Webner is one of 30 reserves. Actually, Nicole, if you want to move to the next slide, sorry. Across the U.S., including, Puerto Rico's, we have one out there too. And all of these reserves are a partnership between NOAA and basically the property owner. In our case, it's the state agency, DCR, but others might be with a university or a nonprofit land trust. You can go ahead to the next slide, Nicole. So Waquoit Bay Reserve is one of four in New England. And the reserve was, just to show you on the map here, we're basically located, we straddle both East Falmouth and part of Mashpee. The reserve was established in 1988. The majority of the property is owned by Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. There's also a portion that's owned by Fish and Game. That's up in the Quashnet Woods area. The reserve boundary encompasses about 2,800 acres, and half that's open water. It is one of the most studied estuaries in the Northeast, and we often refer to it as a living outdoor laboratory, but I think you could also say the same as it's a living and primarily outdoor classroom and training site. All NAIRs have, the education and stewardship coordinators, but obviously research and then the training and engagement program is our fourth core one. In the next slide, I just wanted to highlight the missions of Webner and DCR. So I'm just waiting for the slide. There we go. So Waquoit Bay Reserve's mission is to promote science-based decision-making that leads to healthy coastal ecosystems. And DCR's is to protect, promote, and enhance our commonwealth of natural, cultural, and recreational resources for the well-being of all. And I think the stewardship role really, both of these are merged together when we think about what the stewardship role at the reserve focuses on. And just to give you sort of a brief picture of what some of that looks like, on the next slide, I have just a few photos and talking about some of the work that I do. It's largely about monitoring for, we have several special status and rare species and habitats at the reserve. So a lot of monitoring for that, both wildlife and plants. And then in addition, working on with all, our partners on opportunities for restoration and protection of other sort of undeveloped properties within the reserve watershed. So I've, been really fortunate to work on lots of great, interesting projects with the community members, lots of great volunteers, and we just have a wonderful network of partners that makes all of this possible. Yeah, and then occasionally I get to channel my inner bird, which I threw in a photo here. If I was doing this, it would have popped up. But so once that comes up, and we'll move to the next slide. So one of the one of the key tasks of the stewardship role is similar to Nicole, monitoring for and understanding how to best manage um, threats to the environment, such as from invasive species. And so, leading into why we're talking about this topic here today, basically, um, I was going to say last in the fall of 2024, I had started hearing about Southern Pine Beetle and some of the signs to look for. And so it was one fateful day in late November. I don't know if can you advance the slide, please, Nicole? Um, I was actually out working on some habitat mapping and was coming back on the boat down the middle of the bay to headquarters when I see on the right here, there's a picture of this bright yellow beacon um, from the eastern shore of Washburn Island. Like, hey, that is different. So I went over there, take a closer look, took some photos, and reached out to Nicole, and that was really our main sort of first time contacting each other. And Nicole confirmed, yep, I know what that is. And so now I'm going to pass it back to her, and Nicole's going to tell you a lot more about the beetles and basically how they got here.
Thank you, Ryan. So I will keep an eye on the chat. So if people have questions as we go along, feel free to add anything in there, and I'll try to answer it as we go along. But if not, at the end, we'll go through and capture any questions that we missed. And taking this back to basics for those of you that know nothing about Southern pine beetle, it is a very small bark beetle species. So beetles, for those of you entomologists about, are beetles, and within that grouping there are weevils, and within weevils there are bark beetles. And most of these are living, as the name suggests, just under the bark on our woody plant species. Some will go are in twigs, some will be more in roots, and can be very specialized to species and area. Um, and we have hundreds of native bark beetle species too. So the southern pine beetle is native to the southeastern United States and has been expanding its range northward over the last few years, and it can be an incredibly destructive forest pest. So most bark beetles that are in our forests have a role. They help break down dead and declining trees. They have outbreaks that can help create these. And what sets southern pine beetle apart is that they will attack healthy trees and can readily kill mature trees and whole stands of trees. So how do they do this when they are so tiny? They are smaller than a grain of rice. They actually get in and penetrate into a tree. They go into the layer just under the bark that's called the cambium layer, and that's the area that a tree uses to move nutrients up and down. And as they feed in there, they make tunnels, they lay eggs, their pupa develop, and they damage that cambium layer and feed on the tree itself and can rapidly kill a tree that way. So in the south, they have pretty wide pine species. They prefer the 2 and 3 needle pines, which are considered like the hard pines compared to your 5 needle pines, like white pine, that are considered the soft pines. So they prefer in the south like loblolly and shortleaf pines. But up here in the northeast, our native pine species that they prefer are pitch pine. And pitch pine are, some people don't love them, some people it's their favorite tree. They really love growing in a harsh environment. They love growing on that sandy outwash plain in the southeast. They like sandy, gravelly soils, dry conditions. They are the tree that really survives where no other tree always wants to live. Um, and beyond having those coastal pine barren communities and oak woodland communities where you find pitch pine, we also have these ridgetop pine communities where the trees are dwarfed. The tree in the picture there, decades to 100 years old. And these are actually incredibly rare communities. They're in S1 endangered areas. We also have our coastal um, uh, dune growth of pitch pine, which are also these, most of the time, these very small, shrubby. Sometimes the whole tree blows over and still just starts growing upward. So they really just thrive in these really harsh environments. And those ridgetop and dune are really rare. Luckily, those growth forms for pitch pine are less susceptible to southern pine beetle. So even though they are at risk for things like climate change and human land use changes, they're very, since they're so small and grow so slow and are such harsh environments, they're actually really tight and too hard for beetles to penetrate. But the areas we're really concerned about are our pitch pine forests, where we see these large mature trees, and that's the majority of the pitch pine that we're going to see throughout Massachusetts. And we have those nice continuous corridors along the shore, out through the Cape on both the Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket Islands. But we also find pockets of pitch pine in the interior of Massachusetts. So as the glaciers receded, they left these pockets of sand and gravel. That community get this question a lot. So there is a relatively low risk to our white pine. So that is the other dominant native pine species we have here in Massachusetts, and they can be attacked by southern pine beetle. Southern pine beetle can survive in white pine, but they're just less successful. They have less fecundity, and it is less likely that a stand of white pine are going to be infested. But or adjacent to pitch pine that are actively being infested by southern pine beetle, you can see that them being attacked. So in its native range in the south, southern pine beetle have been a huge problem and something that li- land stewards and managers and foresters have been dealing with for 100 years as they've been using those southern forests for timber management and growth. So especially the loblolly plantations down there are really hard hit by southern pine beetle, and they have these kind of cycles where we see significant outbreaks, widespread, areas where it's localized. But there's actually been less outbreaks and infestations in more recent decades. And some of that is due to how they're managing timber stands, how they're actually growing, and the genetic diversity they're using in those stands. So it seems like stands where they were planting genetically similar, very tight, very closely growing pines. We're having more frequent outbreaks, but they're actually seeing less problems with southern pine beetle, as we up here in the Northeast have been seeing more and more problems with southern pine beetle. Um, and in the South, there's up to 8 generations per year. They have a lethal cold temperature that they just weren't able to overcome in the north. But as our climate is changing, as we're getting warmer temperatures, longer growing seasons, we are seeing our risk increase, and we're starting to see more of a population sneak up. So in the early 2000s, there were outbreaks in New Jersey and their pine barrens that were really significant. And then in 2014, there was widespread outbreaks in New York. And we first saw our outbreak here in 2023. And when we see this kind of trend that we're expecting to get these warmer temperatures, it's really the warmer winter temperatures that are going to be the most impactful. So in lab settings where they like super cool bugs down and see how cold it needs to be to kill them, southern pine beetle die right around under 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So sometimes the larvae will die a little bit warmer than that, but for adults to get significant kill, it needs to be 4 degrees. So here in Massachusetts, they're overwintering in multiple life phases or the bark during the winter. So we really need to hit that coldest temperature to make sure we kill off the population. And 4 degrees it happens, but it's warm in a tree. It's cozy. It's protected. So it needs to be actually a little bit colder air temperature for them to actually feel that temperature within a tree. So in the Northeast, we're kind of seeing it, it increase. We've been catching them in traps and detecting in low levels since we first started looking in 2014, along the Cape, where it is that little bit warmer that allowed them to kind of take hold. And Southern Pine Beetle are very small, very light, very good flyers, so they're able to get on a wind current and blow really far, which is how they're able to move so far up the coast. It's really not like other invasives where human assisted movement is really significant. A lot of this is wind dispersal and their ability to naturally move. And you've probably seen or heard in the news things like mountain pine beetle that out west is causing really significant problems. And this is another native insect that is, because of the changing climate, particularly the droughts they start seeing in Rocky Mountain range, is causing significant is a mountain pine beetle in the same genus Dendrocnus as on the right, our southern pine beetle. And they look really similar. They are very closely related. They are both native to North America, making their outbreaks and impact on our forests much more significant. But you also have the western pine beetle, closely related a little bit further out in California. You also see the Jeffrey pine beetle. So throughout North America, and kind of the big ranges where we see changes in our forests, we see these very closely related bark beetles. And here in the Northeast, the other bark beetle we see in that genus is the black turpentine beetle. We also have a red turpentine beetle, which we usually see the black one. And once again, looks pretty similar, but it causes a little bit different damage. The black turpentine beetle usually only attacks stressed trees. You'll see usually from eye level down is all the damage you'll see. And there'll be these oozy, runny kind of clumps coming out of the tree. And when a black turpentine beetle group attacks a tree, it doesn't necessarily kill the tree. If the tree was already stressed and weakened, it may kind of cause that final decline. But you see lots of trees that keep surviving and just have these like really funky pitch tubes and globs hanging out of them. And even though the black turpentine beetle and southern pine beetle look really similar, um, if you actually had them in your hand, you would easily be able to notice the difference because the black turpentine beetle is quite a bit larger. So it is the one up on the top right group, and then southern pine beetle is the bottom on the right column. So they are actually, even though like they are a similar beetle, have a similar structure, the size difference is actually really noticeable once you get them in your hands. So how do we know if it's southern pine beetle? There's all these other bark beetles, all these other things going on in our trees. How do we know that what is happening is actually southern pine beetle? And one of the things that usually bark beetles emerge when there's like 100 growing degree days, which basically is like once it really starts you get those nice spring days and you want to be outside, they're ready to go. Nights are getting above freezing, we'll start to see emergence. And when they emerge in the spring, they actually have like a little bit more body fat so they can handle a longer journey and they'll start to disperse. And when they're dispersing, they'll aggregate together. So one finds a really awesome tree, sends a signal out to his friends and say, it's awesome, come hang out with me. And they'll be attracted in and they'll start getting into what we can like start to referring as a hot spot. So usually by May, you'll start to see those initial colonizers coming into the stand, and they'll rapidly start making more baby southern pine beetle. They'll start spreading out into the adjacent trees and moving through that forest stand. So usually by the end of June and July, you'll start noticing really easily dead trees. And you'll first start to see yellow discoloration on the needles, and they'll quickly brown up and kind of have a really orange look to them. So if it's in your yard or an area you walk, trees that had looked really nice and healthy in March, April, early May, and then suddenly it's the end of June, early July, and you're seeing a lot of these trees with these really, and when you get up a little bit closer to the tree, the thing that really stands out are these pitch tubes. So when a southern pine beetle penetrates into a tree does not want them in there. So a healthy tree is going to push out these pitch to try to push the beetles back out again. They can actually swim up there. Just they're trying so hard to get into these bark plates. So pitch pine usually have these kind of thick bark plates, and the beetles don't want to waste energy going like through that. So they're going to find the easiest entry, usually in the cracks and crevices between them. And that's where they try to make their initial entry and where you'll see these pitch tubes. And when the pitch first gets pushed out, it's going to be whitish and kind of gloppy. As it starts to oxidize, it'll turn a little bit more reddish. But the holes are so tiny that these beetles make. It doesn't really run. It kind of dries and it looks like a piece of popcorn or a piece of gum just stuck right to the bark. And you'll notice them from about 10 feet up the tree to about 20, depending on the tree size or how much the population is. Once you get a really big infestation, they'll start moving lower down the tree and up higher into the canopy. Uh, and you'll also notice as the population develops and the next generation grows and emerges out, you'll start noticing these push pin sized holes. It's kind of hard to see on this picture, but they're these little tiny holes in the bark where they'll bore their way back out again. And you'll kind of see on the picture on the left, that's a tree that's wet because it rained, but you can kind of see how the colors will look a little bit different on those pitch tubes, depending on how old they are, just the light you're seeing them in, like lichen on your tree. And once you kind of crack under the bark, this is kind of the final proof. So there are other bark beetles that are a similar size to southern pine beetle, will attack pines, can cause pitch tubes like that. So we want to look for kind of the signature of their galleries, which are kind of these like serpentine zigzagging throughout the bark. Other bark beetles have much more more of a pattern to them. So there are a group of bark beetles called ips, and they'll have like a really centralized gallery and then like fans going out on both sides. So if there's not a particularly great pattern to it, it can be southern pine beetle. And usually you can find someone at the scene of the crime. So they get caught in the pitch a lot. They can sometimes be still in the galleries. Sometimes adults don't reemerge and they just die in the galleries, and you're able to find a sample in there. Or you can find a pre-adult pupa that's very easy to distinguish the features that hasn't emerged yet. And you also notice this discoloration, this black streaking. Southern pine beetle, like a lot of other bark beetles, have funguses associated with them that they actually bring to new trees with them. So they bring the funguses on these little pouches on their body, and those funguses help break down the tree and help make it a little bit easier for the southern pine beetle to attack. And you'll see kind of that discoloration in that crosshair. And if you look at the base of the tree, sometimes you'll see this really fine sawdust, and that is basically beetle poop. So as they're eating the wood products and pushing it back out those little tiny pinholes, they push their frass out, and it's that very fine sawdust. You can also look to see other predators that feed on southern pine beetle. The biggest one are these clarid beetles. They're also referred to as checkered beetles, or they have a common name called the bark beetle destroyer, and they basically will like run around the tree and rip the heads off of bark beetles they find and just like devour them. This year, we've also been seeing a lot of woodpecker feeding on the beetle larvae. So things like little downy woodpeckers will feed on it, and as they kind of scurry up and down the tree and try to get in there to get at the larvae, they cause the bark to kind of flake off. So you'll see areas on the higher parts of the tree that like just look weird and discolored because all the bark's been shaved off by woodpeckers looking for some nice tasty treats. And even though there are predators, I will say the predators are kind of an indicator for us, but they are not impactful enough to control the population. There are just so many southern pine beetle. They will have as many generations as they can fit into a year. So up here, when it's starting to get warmer, these longer seasons, or down south, they'll have, as I said, up to eight. So it's just a huge number of beetles that these other populations kind of can't scale at the same ability to keep them under control. So when did these first arrive in Massachusetts? So it was first started looking for them in 2015 after the outbreaks in New York, and they were basically immediately detected. Like once we put these traps out there, and these traps use pheromones that mimic the chemicals that the beetles release, the male and female beetles release to attract each other, but also the chemicals an attacked tree, like a tree, it's called volatile compound. So when these trees are stressed and being attacked, they're also releasing chemicals that can be really attractive to the beetles. And these traps kind of mimic it. And they're very incredibly useful and pretty accurate at being able to detect if you have beetles nearby. It can be tricky to like gauge your population from it and like do some of those more like you can't really get as in-depth answers, but you can know like, yes, they are here and kind of relative quantities. So in 2015, I detected them. We'd find them in different parts of the state, throughout the Cape, on the islands, even like out in places like Montague, and Southampton. There were beetles, but we'd find like two or eight in a trap, like really low numbers, not very consistent. And it really wasn't until 2022 we started to see an uptick in the numbers, and then 2023 and 2024 were really huge numbers. And you can see 2024 is like right at the 2000, and that is because there were so many beetles being caught in such a short window. We actually took the traps were taken down early, to avoid attracting too many beetles into the area because you can actually get them too excited and they can bump into trees on their way to the traps, and it can cause those trees to become infested. So at a point, your risk versus reward of like knowing where they are versus potentially bringing them in kind of has to be counterweighed when using a tool like this. So 2022, we started getting a little individual infested trees were found, and these were really small, just not a big problem, didn't seem to be spreading very low numbers. But the first outbreaks were detected in 2023. So simultaneously on Martha's Vineyard and Nantucket, there were active pockets of infestation found. And they were both found really early. Like, so people were knew what to look for, had their eyes on the ground, and we were able to detect these. And then in 2024, on Washburn Island was the first detection in closer to the mainland. And then this last winter in 2025, there were multiple pockets that we found, um, on the mainland within in the Mashpee and Falmouth areas. So the outbreaks on the island were, on Nantucket was detected first, and it was managed pretty rapidly. But the outbreak on Martha's Vineyard was much more aggressive population, much more advanced, and actually had several unique hotspots that popped up at the same time. One of which was on Manny State Forest, which is the picture on the left. And so when you have these infestations and these large outbreaks, there are kind of limited options for control. And the main thing you can kind of do is cut trees down to kind of disrupt this outbreak cycle. And it kind of has two reasonings for it. The first is those beetles are signaling to each other. They're just perpetuating more and more movement by signaling using chemicals that where they are when they're leaving trees behind and vacating and the direction that they're moving. So if you cut down the infested trees and a buffer of trees around them, it helps break up that cycle, gets more airflow, doesn't have that dense chemical signature anymore. So it helps minimize your stand mortality and kind of slow that population growth. You do see some population decrease because you cut the trees down and some haven't completed their life cycle, but there are still beetles that can emerge from those trees. Pesticides and like other tools like pheromone methods kind of have a limited impact when you already have an outbreak population. They can kind of be used preventatively somewhat. Things like contact pesticides like bifenthrin can be sprayed like onto the bark of a tree, but it's really not something that can be used at scale and can have limited efficacy. In the south and also in the west with mountain pine beetle, they use chemicals like Veribone to like try to keep the population away from trees. Um, well, it has limited success rates and kind of mixed results, and it is also not labeled for use as a pesticide here in Massachusetts, which our colleagues at MDAR recently let us know about. So some of those tools that are used other places are actually not available to use here in the Northeast. But when you're kind of cutting and doing these suppression cuts, um, you basically need to identify your your infestation, mark it out, and kind of decide how you're going to approach this, what your resources are, what your capabilities. And sometimes it's just not possible to you can want to take these big steps, but it can be really challenging. So sometimes it's things like just cutting and leaving, where you still know you're going to have some beetles emerge, and it has less success than if you're able to cut and remove outbreaks and doing suppression. They are in timber stands. They're in areas that have access to cut and remove timber. So it is easy for them sometimes to get in, do a cut maybe earlier than they had planned for harvesting, but it's easier for them sometimes to remove trees compared to here in the Northeast in our pitch pine forest. These are more natural communities. We don't have timber value in it. And there are places like on the islands where it is actually challenging to remove this material and bring it somewhere else to dispose of. So in Manicrella State Forest, we found that initial pocket through our aerial survey in 2024. We went out on the ground, confirmed that it was Southern Pine Beetle, and began suppression actions in September to try to slow that population growth down. And it was a joint effort between DCR's forestry program, their park operations staff, and their fire control staff to kind of get out there and get it down. And since it is challenging for us to even get to the island, because our staff weren't based there, um, getting this work done and the timing restrictions, it was really challenging. So we were only able to cut and leave those trees. So we cut around 200 trees in the fall of 2024 in those pockets. Um, and it did reduce the population, but we did still continue to see the population expand after this. So you can kind of see in May 2023, aerial view, forest looking great, not seeing any dead trees. In March of 2024, you can see the areas that we cut down here along the trails, and that areas where the suppression happened. But then by June of 2025, that population was still able to persist in those stands and spread to an area like 5 times the size of the initial pockets, just because the limited options we had at this site from cutting and leaving operations. Ryan, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Thank you. I'm just gonna pop in here to talk a bit about the operations that we conducted on Washburn Island. So yeah, right in the midst of dealing with the pines over on the vineyard, I contacted Nicole and say, hey, guess what? We got some more over here. And one thing I wanted to point out in this picture of these, it was a small group, I think of maybe 8 uh, pine trees that we found were infested, but they're right on the edge of this bluff. Most of them have a lot of their roots exposed. It's very sandy soil. So they're obviously very highly stressed trees, which likely has played a role in attracting the beetles to them. Something else, just in general, about the pitch pine forest on Washburn Island is it's incredibly dense. There's a lot of trees there, and that is also something else that plays a role in susceptibility. So, Nicole, go ahead and advance to the next slide. When we were discussing the plan to take care of this first infestation we found out there, there was a lot of factors we had to consider, which Nicole mentioned just a minute ago. with dealing with an island. And even though Washburn Island is, right there close to the coast, it's still not that easy to access. There's no way to bring heavy equipment onto it. And really, it's just a highly sensitive area, high concentration of important cultural and natural resources, archaeologically. It's very important to the Mashpee Wampanoag tribe. Um, and so this is a really detailed slide here, but I just wanted to get the point across that, um, you know, it's a high sensitive area. And so there's a lot that we had to take into consideration when deciding how to take care of this. And so the next slide will show you, we implemented a cut and leave plan that was very minimal, basically like probably not the ideal size of a suppression cut. We tried to focus on a much smaller area. Of course, it's, smack dab right in the middle of the beloved campground on the island. But yeah, we got everything set up and ready to go in February last year. And it was great crew that came out, and we managed to get done what needed to be done. Left the piles there, and then a couple months later, DCR Fire Control came out and burned the brush piles at least. A few months after that, continued doing some monitoring. Had assistance from DCR Forest Health come out a couple times, and initial survey, we found a few trees roughly indicated by this dashed line area. And that was in August. Month goes by, and I got a report from one of our partners who was camping out there of some trees that they found along this trail that goes across the middle of the island. And so I went out to have a look and try to map where those were located. That was in late September. You can go ahead and advance, Nicole. And then I started thinking, okay, we should try and do some more cutting here pretty soon. And so I reached out to DCR, Forest Health and Fire Control. We came out and looked and tried to make a plan. And I also mapped as many of the trees as I could determine were either already dead or infested. And so this map shows, with those yellow dash lines, more or less the areas that we focused on. And it was primarily just looking at a safety risk. Like, would these trees, when they're dead, pose a hazard on the campground area or the trails? It wasn't, and we didn't have the time or resources to try and do a full suppression cut. And so that's where things are at the moment. And I just want to acknowledge on the next slide the teams that came out to help us with this work. So for the first cut in February, we had DCR Forestry and Fire Control crew that was led by our District 1 Fire Warden, Josh Nigro, and Nicole was there as well. And then for the December cut, Josh Nigro again led the crew. We had 7 Sawyers, and we were also grateful to have a lot of great help from 7 AmeriCorps Cape Cod members. So just want to acknowledge those partners. Thank you. And I'll let Nicole take it back, and she's going to talk about what's next.
So going into this winter, I was very stressed. I felt a lot of dread about this, even though I kind of happy to leave some of these bugs in the past. Um, it was still really a significant part of the work my team was doing, and something I was really concerned about. And there were multiple pockets of infested trees that have been documented this last winter. Um, my crew is doing a pine barrens restoration project in the Mashpee Pine Barrens, and in the town Pine Barrens property adjacent. And when just doing our normal marking, surveying, prep work, identified a pocket of mortality, and we started looking at our other properties like Francis Crane. We found multiple pockets of infested trees there, and even just driving around, like we were in a parking lot, and we're like, oh, this is right there. So there were enough of a population has been blowing in off of the Martha's Vineyard, and conditions this last year had been right, where they this fall were able to kind of disperse and land in these areas for October. And our small numbers, most were like 5 to 25 trees that we've been seeing. But these were trees that were already really rapidly killed going into this winter. But then I know it's been rough. I know you guys had a crazy storm last the last week. But this winter has been great. It has been so cold, and really started to make me kind of like ease off that heartburn a little bit. So the last week of January, temperatures approached 0 degrees throughout a significant portion of the Cape, particularly in this Falmouth Mashpee area. And those temperatures should be cold enough to kill off like over 90% of that population. So most of those hot spots that were infested this last fall will likely fizzle out and not see growth or expansion going into the spring. It was even cold enough out on the Martha's Vineyard and the islands to knock those populations back. So we'll see a little bit less pressure of those blowing in on the winds this spring. So it is Southern Pine Beetle is here to stay. It's a problem we're going to have to deal with long term. But at least going into this spring, we have a little bit of a reprieve from this population. So thinking about that, kind of what comes next. So we know that this is going to be a part of our landscape. What do we do going forward? And it is having early detection is still really critical. I will say for these significant outbreaks we have found such so far, um, the Nantucket Conservation Foundation that founded out on Nantucket knew what to do really quickly, knew how to confirm it, and were able to respond quickly. It was found on other private properties like the Sheriff's Meadow Foundation, on Martha's Vineyard, and on the state forest. And at both sites was found relatively quickly. Both surveys by the forest health team. So even though, and then Ryan caught it driving by on a boat from hundreds of feet away, like knew what to look for, picked it up. So having early detection is a really critical tool because it still gives you options and helps maintain some level of safety. Part of the work that was undertaken on Washburn was it was a public safety concern beyond maintaining like that resource and the habitat. It is a campground and people are sleeping under those trees and maintaining a safe conditions. So continuing tracking these infestations, watching hotspot growth, but also exploring new technologies and techniques to improve our detection capabilities. My team is starting to use UAVs to help us more rapidly do assessments and also be able to get better visual assessments and tracked over time to see if there is growth of these hot spots. And also using this time, this reprieve we have to work on developing response plans, decision trees, and action thresholds. And those like are fancy terms and state agencies like MassWildlife and DCR kind of plan on a bigger scale and towns may be working on a bigger scale. But even homeowners, it is kind of important where do I have pitch pine? Are they healthy? Are they a risk to my home if they fell or died? Um, what is the safety concern and like what you would do and what your threshold for taking action would be? And the other really important thing is to improve the resiliency of our forests. So we have these pitch pine forests that some of them are not particularly, their baseline's not great. They're not healthy to begin with. What can we do to actually make these trees more resistant to southern pine beetle infestation, but also resilient um, post infestation? So we do see a lot of mortality. You'll see healthy trees die, but trees are also going to survive these outbreak events. So how do we make it so that we're not losing an entire stand or an entire forest? Because not all pitch pine are equally susceptible. So we're kind of lucky here in Massachusetts because we've seen what's happened on Long Island and in New York. They have very similar systems to us. They're pitch pine grow in very similar form, fashion, similar types of forests. So a lot of the research that's been done there is really applicable to what we have over here. And when they were kind of looking at a hazard rating tool, so determining what conditions make trees more likely to be infested and have more of that risk level. The first thing is the sandy soil. So a sandier soil is going to have a higher risk level than a loamy soil, and the density, your basal area of your pitch pines is going to increase it. So the more dense your trees are and the sandier your soil, the more increase your height. So sandy soils are really they have these grains that are really gritty. There's a lot of space between them. They don't oil. It's kind of a mix of sand, silt, and clay. So there's smaller gaps between the particles, and they kind of have a little bit. So a pitch pine growing on a sandier soil has less water available to it, so it might not push pitch out as well as a pitch pine on a loamier soil. And basal area is just like a fancy way to like figure out how much tree do you have in an area. So it's not just the number of trees, but also how big those trees in that area actually are. And it's a tool that method that foresters use a lot for measuring areas. So how do we improve resiliency? And I know this is sometimes hard to say, but cutting down trees helps save trees. So doing an important tool. So thin stands usually have a lower hazard rating. And part of that is that there's more air movement and space between the trees. So those pheromone chemicals spread out a little bit more. The trees themselves are a little bit um, more able to overcome those outbreaks and fight off initial infestations. And you can kind of see, so the top two pictures are unmanaged stands, all really close together, versus what kind of a managed stand looks like. So an area that is more open, there's more space between those trees, and there's more opening in the canopy between scrub oaks growing in between, blueberries or other herbaceous growth below the pitch pine. And so for my team, we are already doing a lot of work that is managing our pitch systems. And luckily, it aligns a lot with some of these targets and goals for Southern Pine Beetle. But we have been integrating kind of what this resiliency is into our habitat management plans and restoration projects, and thinking about how can we're doing this work. Our targets are for these natural communities and these pine barrens, which are a globally rare resource that we're trying to protect and the species that only grow in these conditions. How can we kind of build in this resiliency to Southern Pine Beetle so we're maintaining pitch pine in these resources going forward? Uh, and we do that through a lot of different tools of cutting, of thinning, of things like prescribed fire, because pitch pine are a disturbance dependent natural community. So those dry conditions, those areas can really dry out in the summer. They have a more common natural wildfire cycle. It's also incredibly windy in coastal areas and saltburn and nor'easters, and other events that cause a lot of physical disruption and damage, which pitch pine really thrive under. Other areas we see a lot of pitch pine in the state are like along railway corridors where the sparks from trains for decades would light things on fire and pitch pine would grow in it. Um, and a lot of our human development and landscape use has kind of altered these natural disturbance events. So urban regimes, and create kind of the natural structure we would normally see in these areas. And a big concern is also maintaining, as I said before, public safety. So I saw a question in the chat of like, if a tree is dead, should we leave it? And sometimes, yes, like if a tree is fully dead, there's no more Southern Pine Beetle in it. Like dead trees are still incredibly key component of our forests. They are resources for a lot of wildlife. But when you have a stand full of hundreds to thousands of dead trees, it kind of poses a little bit different of a public safety risk. Because if you have dead trees near your homes or along our roadways or in our recreation areas, they are going to start to fall apart. So you'll see branches dropping usually within a year or so. And within a few years, you can have the whole tree kind of falling over, creating safety. Also, having more dead trees can create wild. But when you have these dead trees that are either standing as snags or even down woody material, it makes access into these areas a lot more challenging to be able to respond to wildfires in densely populated areas near homes. And a lot of this is, I mean, the main goal here is being proactive versus reactive. And events like this are kind of the first step. So like we can only be proactive if people know about this threat we have, and kind of spreading the word about it. Ryan and I work closely with a lot of other partners and colleagues, with all different kind of landowners and groups from like land trusts and NGOs and towns and the National Seashore and the military base, of all these landowners that are really starting to think about this threat and what it means long term to our forest and how we can kind of share information and resources, to be able to keep responding to this concern, maintain a safe environment, and to kind of protect our pitch pine resources long term. And anything else to add?
No, I think, and we're right on time actually. So that was great. Thank you very much. I think we'll hand it over to Sonia or Lori from here.
Yeah, I think we've got a couple questions that have come in, but it seems like most of them have been answered during your presentation. You mentioned what the natural predators were for the beetles, um, and you talked about at the end the closing of our future of our pitch pine woodlands on Cape Cod. I think here there's a question I think for Ryan. Um, It looks like the infested trees have been found along the trails. Has the rest of the island, Washburn Island, been surveyed?
It it is surveyed annually when they do the aerial surveys. But yeah, like the interior parts from the ground, we haven't gotten to that yet. We certainly from going forward, we're going to make much more of an effort to take a closer look. I mean, this is just in the past year that's been found there, and likely it's going to be spreading. So, but yeah, the aerial surveys sometimes detect it, but on the ground, it's usually, um, you know, you get a closer look and find more that might not have been captured by the aerial surveys. Oh, I
It
did
is
want to
very
share.
hard to do ground surveys, like fighting through scrub.
Ryan, did you have something to add?
Yeah, just before people sign off, I meant to share a link to some story maps that DCR Forest Health has put together about lots of different forest pests, but there's one about Southern Pine Beetle, just to give some more information, has some nice short videos and photos and things. I think Nicole, I don't know what I heard you start talking about the difficulty of doing ground surveys, and yeah, I mean, Washburn Island, the interior, there's tons of poison ivy and briar, and so it's just really, yeah, it's almost impossible in some cases, but yeah, so we just do the best we can.
Well, thank you both, Ryan and Nicole, for sharing about the Southern Pine Beetle. Thank you, everyone who came and listened to the presentation. Um, in the chat, I did type a survey. If you had a couple minutes to go through and complete a post-program survey, we really appreciate that. It helps us shape this series, as well as future programming at the reserve. Thank you, everyone.